A cold businessman blackmailed his secretary into marriage. But her love changed him forever. Adrian Sterling sat in his high-rise office, gazing out over the city skyline. From this height, everything looked small, just like the people beneath him, scrambling to survive while he thrived. He built his empire through ruthless ambition, turning a once-failing company into a corporate giant. To the world, he was a self-made man, a visionary. But inside the walls of Sterling Enterprises, he was known for something else, his cruelty. Employees feared him, knowing that even the slightest mistake could cost them their jobs. There was no room for weakness, no tolerance for errors. If someone failed him, they were discarded without hesitation. Adrian believed emotions were a weakness. He had seen what they did to people, how they made men beg, how they made women desperate. He had no use for such things. In business, numbers mattered. Profit and power mattered. Feelings? They only got in the way. And so, he crushed anyone who stood in his path. Just last week, he had finalized a deal that put a rival company out of business. The owner, a man who had spent his life building that company from the ground up, had begged Adrian for mercy. Adrian had simply watched, impassive, as the man lost everything. Mercy was for fools, and Adrian Sterling was no fool. In the heart of this unforgiving empire worked Emma Carter, his personal secretary. She was efficient, intelligent, and always professional. She never let her emotions show, no matter how much pressure Adrian put on her. But beneath the surface, she was struggling. Unlike Adrian, she had a heart, one that bore the weight of responsibilities far beyond the walls of this office. Every day, she balanced work and family, taking care of her younger brother, Caleb, who was sick. The medical bills kept piling up, and no matter how hard she worked, she could never earn enough. She had taken extra jobs, cut back on expenses, and sacrificed every luxury just to keep Caleb's treatments going. Despite it all, Emma never let her hardships affect her work. She believed in doing things the right way, in staying true to her principles. But working under Adrian made that difficult. His world was one of power and wealth, a world where kindness was seen as a flaw. Still, she had no choice but to endure it. She needed this job. It paid well, and she couldn't afford to lose it, not when her brother's life depended on it. One evening, as the office emptied out and only a few people remained, Adrian called Emma into his office. She entered, holding her notepad, expecting another late-night list of demands. But tonight, his expression was different, colder, more calculating. He gestured for her to sit. "There's something I need to discuss with you, Miss Carter," he said, his voice even. Emma sat cautiously, her grip tightening around her pen. "Yes, sir." Adrian leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "I know about your brother." Her breath caught in her throat. She had never spoken about Caleb at work. "How'd he know?" "I know about his illness, the debts you're drowning in," he continued. "And I know about your brother's recent mistake." Emma's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" Adrian slid a folder across the desk. With hesitant hands, she opened it, and the color drained from her face. Inside were documents, emails, and photographs, evidence of something terrible. Her brother had been framed in a financial scandal, one that could ruin his future and send him to prison. "I can make this disappear," Adrian said smoothly, watching her reaction. "I have the power to erase this from existence. No investigations, no charges. Your brother walks free." Emma's head spun. This couldn't be happening. "What do you want?" she whispered. A slow, predatory smile spread across Adrian's face. "Marry me." She recoiled as if struck. "What?" Adrian leaned back in his chair, utterly composed. "You're smart, Emma. You know how the world works. I need a wife. Someone who fits my image. Someone respectable, loyal, and untainted by scandal. You fit the role perfectly." Emma shook her head, disbelief clouding her thoughts. "Why me? You could have anyone." "I don't trust anyone," Adrian interrupted. "But you have too much to lose. I know you won't betray me." She felt sick. This wasn't a proposal. It was a transaction, a prison sentence disguised as marriage. "This is insane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's expression hardened. Your brother's fate is in my hands. If you refuse, I won't lift a finger to help him. Tears burned behind her eyes. He was forcing her into this, taking away her choice. She could fight, but what then? Caleb would be destroyed. She had no power here. No way out. The silence stretched between them, thick with suffocating tension. Finally, with a trembling breath, Emma whispered the words that sealed her fate. I'll do it. A victorious glint flashed in Adrian's eyes. Good. As she stood and walked out of the office, her world crumbling around her, Adrian watched her go with quiet satisfaction. He had won. Again. But neither of them knew that this deal, this cold, calculated arrangement, would be the beginning of something neither of them expected. Emma barely made it to the elevator before her legs gave out beneath her. She gripped the railing inside, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The weight of what had just happened crushed her. She had just agreed to marry a man who had no love, no kindness, no mercy, only power and control. And yet, she had no choice. Caleb's life depended on her decision. The elevator doors slid open, and she stumbled out into the cold night air. The city stretched out before her, bright lights blinking against the darkness. But for the first time in her life, she felt like there was no escape. She could hear Adrian's voice in her head, calm, calculated, ruthless. You won't betray me. He had trapped her in a cage she couldn't break free from. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Caleb. Hey, Em, just wanted to say thanks for everything. You're the best sister in the world. Love you. Tears welled up in her eyes. He had no idea what she had just done to protect him. No idea what she was about to sacrifice. She swallowed the lump in her throat and typed back, I love you too, Caleb. Always. The next morning, Emma arrived at the office as if nothing had changed, though everything had. Her stomach twisted as she stepped into the building, her heart pounding as she made her way to Adrian's office. He was already there, standing by the window, hands in his pockets, as if he owned the world. And in a way, he did. You're late, he said without turning around. Emma checked the time. It's 8:58. Adrian finally turned, his gaze sharp. I expect you at 8:45 from now on. You're not just my secretary anymore, Emma. You're going to be my wife. That means every part of your life will now revolve around me. She clenched her fists. I'm not your puppet, Adrian. His lips curved into a smirk. No, you're my wife-to-be. That's worse. Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. What do you want from me today? Adrian walked over to his desk, picking up a document. Sign this. Emma took it, her fingers shaking slightly. As she read, she realized it was a contract detailing every aspect of their arrangement. Their marriage would last exactly 2 years. She would attend all public events with him. She would live in his penthouse and be available whenever he needed her. She would have no say in his business affairs. And most importantly, she would never, under any circumstances, fall in love with him. Her hands trembled as she finished reading. You're really this cold, aren't you? Adrian leaned against his desk, watching her. Business is business, Emma. If you're expecting romance, you've chosen the wrong man. She took a deep breath. I never chose you. His smirk didn't falter. And yet, here you are. Emma wanted to throw the papers in his face, to scream at him, to tell him he was the worst kind of man. But instead, she picked up the pen and, with one final glance at him, signed her name. Adrian took the contract from her, satisfied. Welcome to my world, Emma. The wedding was arranged within days. There were no warm moments, no discussions about decorations or vows. It was purely a business deal, and Adrian treated it as such. A luxurious venue was booked, invitations were sent to only the most influential figures, and a wedding dress, one Emma hadn't even chosen, was delivered to her apartment. It was a designer gown, stunning and expensive, but it felt like a costume for a role she never wanted to play. As the day approached, Emma's heart grew heavier. She barely slept, barely ate. The media was already buzzing about Adrian Sterling's mystery bride. Paparazzi had tried to snap photos of her. Reporters had dug into her past, and rumors had spread like wildfire. Some claimed she was an heiress from a hidden family fortune. Others believed she was his secret lover from years ago. None of them knew the truth. On the night before the wedding, Emma sat alone in her apartment, staring at the dress hanging by the window. The city lights reflected off the fabric, making it shimmer like a dream. Except this wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare. A sudden knock on the door made her jump. She hesitated before opening it, only to find Adrian standing there. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, looking as composed as ever. "What are you doing here?" she asked warily. Adrian stepped inside without invitation. "Tomorrow is a big day. I wanted to make sure you understand something before we do this." Emma crossed her arms. "Understand what?" He closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. "Once we say our vows, everything changes. You will no longer be just Emma Carter. You will be Emma Sterling. And that means I belong to you," she snapped. Adrian's jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't correct her. "It means the world will watch us. Every move you make, every word you say, it will all be scrutinized. There's no room for mistakes." Emma's stomach twisted. "And what happens if I break one of your rules?" Adrian took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Then you will regret it." A chill ran down her spine. She hated him. She hated that he had stolen her freedom, that he had backed her into this corner. But most of all, she hated that, for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to fight him. Adrian studied her for a moment longer before stepping back. "Get some rest, Emma. Tomorrow, we become husband and wife." She didn't watch him leave. She didn't have the strength. The wedding day arrived like a storm. The venue was breathtaking, an enormous hall lined with gold chandeliers, marble floors, and flower arrangements that probably cost more than her entire apartment. Guests filled the seats, dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, all waiting to see Adrian Sterling's bride. Emma stood behind the grand doors, her hands shaking inside her silk gloves. She couldn't do this. She didn't want to do this. But then she thought of Caleb. She thought of his smile, his laughter, the way he had always looked up to her. He needed her. And if this was the price she had to pay, then so be it. The doors opened, and the music swelled. Emma stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. At the end of the aisle stood Adrian, looking exactly as he always did, cold, unreadable, powerful. As she reached him, he extended his hand. She hesitated before placing hers in his, her skin burning under his touch. The ceremony passed in a blur. Vows were exchanged, rings were slipped on her fingers, and before she could even process it, the words were spoken. "You may now kiss the bride." Emma barely had time to react before Adrian's lips pressed against hers. It was a calculated kiss, controlled and brief, but it sent a shiver down her spine. The guests applauded, cameras flashed, and just like that, Emma Carter was no more. She was now Emma Sterling, a wife to the devil himself. The wedding reception was a spectacle of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden light. A live orchestra played elegant symphonies, and tables were adorned with rare flowers imported from across the world. The guests were handpicked, CEOs, politicians, and socialites, all watching the union of Adrian Sterling and his mysterious bride with calculated interest. They whispered behind their champagne glasses, speculating about the woman who had managed to capture the most ruthless businessman in the city. Emma sat at the grand table beside Adrian, her fingers clenched around the stem of her untouched wine glass. She had smiled for the cameras, danced when required, and played the role of the perfect bride. But beneath the expensive silk of her gown, her heart was ice cold. This wasn't a wedding, it was a business deal wrapped in gold and diamonds. The vows they had exchanged hours ago held no meaning. The ring on her finger was nothing more than a shackle. She turned slightly, stealing a glance at Adrian. He looked completely at ease, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. To the world, he was the devoted husband, but she knew better. Every interaction, every touch was rehearsed, calculated to convince the world that their marriage was real. But behind closed doors, she was nothing more than a pawn in his game. "Smile, Emma," Adrian murmured without looking at her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "The photographers are watching." Her grip on the glass tightened, but she forced herself to lift the corners of her lips, knowing she had no choice. For the rest of the evening, she played her part flawlessly. She accepted congratulations with a polite nod, listened to toasts praising their so-called love story, and endured Adrian's cold hand resting on the small of her back whenever the cameras turned in their direction. But all the while, she felt like a stranger in her own life. Hours later, when the last of the guests had left and the grand ballroom had emptied, Emma finally let the mask slip. Her feet ached from standing in heels for too long, and the weight of her gown felt suffocating. She turned to Adrian, expecting him to at least acknowledge the exhaustion of the night. Instead, he merely checked his watch and said, "Be ready in 5 minutes. We're leaving." She blinked. Where? The penthouse. Realization sank in. Of course, their wedding night. Not that she expected romance, but the thought of being alone with him in a space that was now meant to be their home sent a shiver down her spine. The penthouse was even grander than she had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the dazzling city skyline, and the marble floors gleamed under the dim glow of modern chandeliers. Every piece of furniture was carefully curated, exuding wealth and taste. But as Emma stepped inside, she felt no warmth. It was a house, not a home. Adrian walked past her, shrugging off his jacket and loosening his tie as he headed toward the bar. He poured himself a glass of whiskey before turning to her. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll have our first public appearance as husband and wife." Emma stood frozen in the middle of the vast living room, her hands clenched at her sides. "That's it." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "What were you expecting?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe some acknowledgement that my entire life was just signed away." His gaze darkened, and he took a slow sip of his drink before replying. "You made your choice, Emma. You knew what this was." Her chest tightened with anger. "I had no choice. You blackmailed me." Adrian walked toward her, stopping just a foot away. "And yet, here you are, wearing my ring, living under my roof." His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "You want to hate me? Go ahead. But don't pretend you didn't know exactly what you were walking into." Emma refused to let him see her break. She lifted her chin. "I might be trapped in this marriage, but I will never belong to you." Something flickered in his gaze, something unreadable, but it was gone in an instant. He stepped back, finishing his drink. "Then I suggest you stay out of my way." With that, he turned and walked into his room, leaving Emma standing alone in the cold silence of her new life. Days turned into weeks, and Emma soon realized that marriage to Adrian was not just loveless. It was suffocating. She was surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Designer clothes filled her wardrobe, a chauffeur drove her anywhere she needed to go, and private chefs prepared extravagant meals. But every indulgence felt like a cage. Every step she took was monitored, every public appearance carefully orchestrated. She was no longer just Emma Carter. She was Emma Sterling, the wife of a powerful man, expected to smile on cue and play her role to perfection. Adrian, true to his word, treated her with distant indifference. In public, he was the perfect husband, attentive, charming, devoted. But the moment they were alone, the facade crumbled. They rarely spoke unless necessary, and when they did, their words were laced with tension. At night, she slept in a separate room, a grand suite that felt more like a hotel than a home. She dined alone, sat through silent car rides, and found herself growing lonelier with each passing day. And yet, she refused to be broken. She had lost her freedom, but she would not lose herself. So when Adrian dismissed her as nothing more than a figurehead, she decided to prove him wrong. One evening, Emma found herself sitting in the study, flipping through financial reports that had been left on Adrian's desk. She had always been good with numbers, and curiosity got the better of her. As she scanned the documents, she noticed something odd, an inconsistency in the projected earnings of one of his latest acquisitions. "You shouldn't touch things that don't concern you." Emma turned to find Adrian standing at the doorway, his expression unreadable. She held up the report. "There's an issue with this. The numbers don't match the market trends. If you continue with this investment, you'll lose millions." Adrian stepped forward, taking the papers from her hands. He scanned them briefly before narrowing his eyes. "And what makes you think I haven't already considered this?" Emma crossed her arms. "Because if you had, you wouldn't have moved forward with it. Either your analysts missed it, or someone is manipulating the data." For the first time, Adrian didn't have a quick retort. He studied her, his sharp gaze searching for something. Finally, he smirked. "I underestimated you." Emma met his gaze without fear. "Yes, you did." A slow, almost amused chuckle escaped his lips. "Careful, Emma. If you keep this up, you might actually start becoming useful." She tilted her head. "And if I already am?" Adrian leaned in slightly, just enough to invade her space. "Then that would make things interesting." A shiver ran down her spine, but she didn't back away. For the first time since their marriage began, she saw something new in his eyes. Not just cold calculation, but something else. Something dangerous. And Emma had no intention of backing down. The days passed in a tense, unspoken battle. Emma continued to play the role of the perfect wife in public, but behind closed doors, she refused to be a mere decoration in Adrian's world. She observed, listened, and learned. If Adrian expected her to fade into the background, he was mistaken. Their Cold War took on a new form when she began attending business meetings. At first, Adrian had dismissed the idea entirely. "You have no reason to be in that room," he told her one morning over breakfast. Emma set down her cup of tea. "I have every reason. I carry your last name, don't I? The media sees me as your partner. Wouldn't it be foolish for me to be ignorant of the empire I'm supposedly a part of?" Adrian's lips curled into a smirk. "You think reading a few reports makes you qualified?" She met his gaze steadily. "I think being underestimated is an advantage." Something flickered in his expression, amusement, irritation, or something in between. But instead of shutting her down, he simply said, "Fine, don't embarrass yourself." It was the closest thing to permission she was going to get. The first meeting was exactly what she expected, a room full of powerful men who barely acknowledged her presence. Adrian, of course, commanded the room effortlessly. He sat at the head of the long glass table, exuding authority with every word he spoke. The executives hung onto his every sentence, nodding, agreeing, barely daring to challenge his decisions. Emma sat quietly at first, observing. She had no illusions about being welcomed. She was just the wife, a silent observer, someone meant to sit prettily and smile. But when the discussion turned to a new expansion deal, she saw the flaw immediately. "This proposal is reckless," she said, cutting through the monotony of blind agreement. All heads turned, some surprised, some amused. Adrian's gaze sharpened. "Is that so?" She pushed the document forward. "Yes, the numbers are inflated. If you move forward, you'll be paying nearly double the actual market value." The CFO cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sterling, these numbers have been vetted by our best analysts." Emma didn't blink. "Then fire them." A heavy silence settled over the room. No one had ever spoken so bluntly in Adrian Sterling's presence, especially not someone who wasn't part of his inner circle. Adrian leaned back in his chair, watching her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, assessing her, testing her. But she refused to waver. Finally, he spoke. "Fix it." The CFO looked stunned. "Sir." Adrian didn't look away from Emma. "She's right. Fix it." It was the first time he had ever acknowledged her insight publicly. And in that moment, something shifted. The executives now looked at her differently, not as an accessory, but as a potential threat. And Adrian? He looked at her like she had just become something far more dangerous than a prisoner. She had become a player. From that day forward, Emma stopped being invisible. She continued attending meetings, offering her insight where it mattered. The executives resented her at first, but when they saw her predictions were accurate, their wariness turned into cautious respect. Adrian, however, was unpredictable. Some days, he challenged her openly, pushing her just to see if she would break. Other days, he seemed amused, as if waiting to see how far she would go. But beneath the battles, beneath the Cold War they waged in silence, there was something else. A spark, a tension neither of them acknowledged. It was in the way Adrian's gaze lingered a second too long when she spoke. The way his smirk faded into something unreadable when she held her ground. The way their arguments felt less like fights and more like a game neither wanted to lose. And Emma? She was no longer sure if she wanted to. One evening, after another long meeting, Emma returned to the penthouse expecting the usual silence. Instead, Adrian was waiting for her in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the city lights casting sharp shadows across his face. "Impressive work today," he said without looking up. Emma crossed her arms. "Is that your way of saying thank you?" A slow smirk curved his lips. "No, it's my way of saying I didn't expect you to be so persistent." She stepped closer. "You underestimated me." His eyes flicked to hers. "I did." A quiet tension filled the air between them. Not hostility, not rivalry, something else entirely. Emma swallowed. "Why did you let me in?" Adrian studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he said, "Because you're not afraid of me." Her breath hitched slightly. He took a step closer, and for the first time since their marriage began, there was something in his eyes that wasn't cold indifference. Something dangerous. Something unspoken. She should have stepped back, but she didn't, and neither did he. The war between them wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. The tension in Sterling Enterprises was palpable. The crisis had hit like a storm, shaking even the most seasoned executives. A deal that had been months in the making was on the verge of collapse. A competitor had leaked confidential information, manipulating the market and causing investors to panic. Stocks were plummeting, and trust in the company was wavering. Adrian was livid. He stood at the center of the chaos, his voice sharp and precise as he fired off orders, his mind working through solutions at a speed that left others scrambling to keep up. But for the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of frustration that he couldn't suppress. Emma watched from the doorway, her fingers tightening around the tablet she held. She knew she shouldn't interfere. This was Adrian's world, one where he thrived in control and power. But something inside her wouldn't let her stay silent. "You're focusing on the wrong angle," she said, stepping forward. The room fell into silence. Executives turned to look at her, some with skepticism, others with outright dismissal. She was the CEO's wife, not a business strategist. Adrian's gaze snapped to her, dark and unreadable. "Enlighten us." She walked to the large digital display at the center of the room, pulling up a market analysis report. "Your biggest mistake was assuming this attack was about numbers. It's not. It's about perception." She turned to face the room. "Investors aren't pulling out because they think Sterling Enterprises is weak. They're pulling out because they believe your competitor has inside knowledge. They think you've already lost." A murmur spread through the room. Emma met Adrian's gaze directly. "You don't need to fix the numbers. You need to fix the narrative." Adrian studied her for a long moment, his sharp mind processing her words. Then he turned to his team. "Schedule a press conference. I want a statement out within the hour." His voice was decisive, controlled. "We'll go on the offensive. Shift the blame, expose the leak, and remind the market why we don't lose." A ripple of urgency spread through the room as executives rushed to follow his orders. Emma expected Adrian to move on, to forget the moment had ever happened. But instead, he lingered. His eyes held something new, something she had never seen before. Respect. As the chaos unfolded around them, he stepped closer, his voice low so only she could hear. "You surprised me, Emma." She tilted her head. "Is that so?" His smirk was faint, but it was there. "I don't like surprises." She met his gaze steadily. "Then you're going to hate what comes next." And for the first time, Adrian Sterling laughed. That rare sound, a quiet, almost reluctant chuckle, sent a strange jolt through Emma. She wasn't sure what startled her more, the fact that Adrian had actually laughed or that it wasn't the cold, mocking kind she had expected. It was brief, gone in an instant, but it lingered in the air between them like an unspoken truth neither was ready to acknowledge. Before she could say anything, Adrian's attention shifted back to the crisis at hand. He barked a few more orders, his sharp mind already calculating the next steps. But as the executives scrambled to contain the fallout, Emma felt his gaze on her, lingering for just a second too long. That night, after the press conference, Emma sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. The house was eerily quiet, its grand halls and endless luxury feeling more suffocating than ever. She should have felt triumphant. She had proven herself, shown Adrian and his entire empire that she wasn't just a powerless pawn in his world. But instead of satisfaction, she felt something far more unsettling. She had seen a glimpse of the man beneath the ruthless exterior, and it terrified her. She didn't want to feel anything for Adrian Sterling. Not pity, not understanding, and certainly not the dangerous warmth that had stirred in her chest when he had looked at her with something other than disdain. A soft sigh broke the silence. Emma turned her head slightly to find Adrian standing in the doorway, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up, a rare sight. He looked tired, not the cold, calculating businessman, but a man carrying a weight that no amount of power could lift. She expected him to say something sharp, to remind her that this marriage was nothing more than a contract. Instead, he surprised her again. "You handled yourself well today." His voice was quieter than usual, devoid of its usual edge. Emma hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I did what needed to be done." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "That's usually my line." Silence stretched between them. It wasn't the usual tension laced with hostility, but something different, something fragile. Adrian exhaled slowly and moved toward the bar, pouring himself a drink. For a moment, she thought he would leave it at that. Another passing conversation, another fleeting moment that meant nothing. But then he spoke again. "My father used to tell me that emotions were a weakness." His tone was even, but there was something raw beneath it, something guarded. He made sure I understood that lesson very early on. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard Adrian speak about his past. Not once. The man she knew, the one who had blackmailed her in a marriage, who wielded power like a weapon, had always seemed untouchable, invincible. But in that moment, he wasn't Adrian Sterling, the ruthless CEO. He was simply a man shaped by the scars of his past. She should have stayed silent, should have let the moment pass. But something in her refused to look away. "That's not strength," she said softly. "It's fear." His grip on the glass tightened. For a second, she thought he would lash out, that the wall he had let crack for just a moment would come crashing back down. But instead, he laughed, a quiet, humorless sound. "You think you have me figured out, don't you?" Emma held his gaze, refusing to back down. "No, but I think you spent a lot of time making sure no one ever does." Adrian didn't respond. He simply took a slow sip of his drink, his expression unreadable. But he didn't walk away either. And that, more than anything, told Emma that she had struck a nerve. Days passed, and the tension between them shifted. It wasn't gone, far from it, but something was different. Adrian no longer dismissed her presence in meetings. He no longer looked at her as if she were merely an inconvenience. Instead, he listened. He challenged her, tested her, but he no longer ignored her. And Emma, against every instinct, found herself drawn to the glimpses of the man beneath the armor. It was in the way he ran a hand through his hair when he thought no one was watching, the way exhaustion crept into his features when he let his guard down. It was in the way his fingers lingered just a second too long when he handed her something, the way his voice softened, just barely, when he spoke to her at night, when the weight of the day was too heavy for even him to carry. She told herself it meant nothing. But then came the moment that shattered every lie she had tried to tell herself. It was late. The city lights cast a soft glow through the massive windows of Adrian's office. Emma stood near his desk, reviewing the latest financial reports, while Adrian leaned against the edge, his tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. They had been going over the details of a new merger, debating strategy when it happened. A simple touch. Her hand brushed against his as she reached for a document. It was nothing, an accident, a fleeting moment. But the second their skin met, the air shifted. Adrian stilled. Emma's breath caught. It was a single moment, barely a heartbeat, but it sent a jolt through both of them. She pulled back quickly, but it was too late. She had seen it. The flicker of something in his eyes. Something raw. Something dangerous. She turned to leave, needing space, needing to breathe. But before she could step away, his voice stopped her. Emma. It was the way he said her name, low, almost hesitant. She turned back, her heart pounding in her chest. For a second, it looked like he might say something, that he might break the unspoken rule they had both been clinging to, that this marriage was nothing but a contract. But then, just as quickly, the moment was gone. His expression hardened. The mask slid back into place. Forget it. Emma exhaled, her chest tightening. She nodded, turned, and walked away. But as she left his office, one thing was painfully clear. She could no longer pretend that nothing had changed, and neither could he. The days that followed were filled with a strange, charged silence. Neither of them spoke about what had happened in Adrian's office, but the air between them was different. Tense, uncertain. Emma told herself she had imagined it. That fleeting moment when Adrian had looked at her not as a pawn, not as an obligation, but as something else entirely. Yet, every time their eyes met, every time his fingers brushed against hers in passing, she knew she hadn't been wrong. Adrian was changing, or maybe he had always been this way, and she was only now seeing it. She noticed it in the smallest of things. The way his hand would linger at the small of her back when they attended public events, a protective instinct he never acknowledged. The way his gaze softened, barely, but enough, whenever she spoke about her brother. The way he no longer dismissed her opinions in meetings, instead waiting to hear what she had to say before making decisions. None of it made sense. This was the same man who had blackmailed her, who had forced her into this life. He wasn't supposed to be capable of kindness, of hesitation, of anything remotely close to humanity. And yet he was. The realization was terrifying, because no matter how much she reminded herself of what he had done to her, of what their marriage was built on, a part of her, a small, treacherous part, had stopped seeing him as the enemy. And that was dangerous. It all came to a breaking point one evening. Emma had spent the day working alongside Adrian on a major acquisition. It was supposed to be a simple deal, but negotiations had grown tense, stretching late into the night. By the time they left the office, exhaustion clung to both of them like a second skin. The car ride home was silent, but not in the way it used to be. It wasn't cold, wasn't filled with resentment or hostility. It was heavy, as if there were too many words left unsaid, too many thoughts neither of them knew how to voice. When they arrived home, Emma didn't go straight to her room. Instead, she found herself walking toward the balcony, drawn by the crisp night air. She needed space, needed to think, needed to remind herself that whatever had been happening between her and Adrian was an illusion. But she wasn't alone for long. She heard the soft creak of the door before she felt his presence behind her. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, just stood there, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Minutes passed before he finally broke the silence. "You should hate me," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Emma's fingers tightened around the railing. "I do." A soft, humorless chuckle. "Liar." Her breath hitched. She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want from me, Adrian?" Something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. "I don't know." It was the honesty in his voice that shattered everything. Because for the first time since she had met him, Adrian Sterling didn't have all the answers. He took a step closer, closing the space between them. Not enough to touch, but enough for her to feel the heat of him, to feel the weight of his presence in a way she never had before. "You make me," he exhaled sharply, as if frustrated with himself. "You make me question everything." Emma's throat tightened. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to feel anything for her. And she wasn't supposed to feel anything for him. But the way he was looking at her now, like she was the only thing in the world that made sense and confused him at the same time, it was too much. "This is a mistake," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Adrian didn't move. Maybe. His gaze dropped to her lips. For one breathless moment, she thought he might close the distance, might do something they could never take back. And the worst part? She wasn't sure she would stop him. But before anything could happen, the sound of a phone ringing shattered the moment. Adrian tensed, jaw clenching as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and something in his expression hardened. Without a word, he turned and walked away, answering the call as he disappeared back inside. Emma exhaled shakily, gripping the railing as if it could steady the chaos inside her. This couldn't happen. She couldn't let it. Because no matter what she thought she saw in Adrian Sterling, he was still the man who had taken away her choices. And she could never forget that. The next few days were different. Adrian was distant, not in the cold, indifferent way he used to be, but in a way that felt almost cautious, as if he was just as shaken by what had happened on the balcony as she was. They went about their lives as if nothing had changed, attending meetings, playing their roles in front of the public. But beneath the surface, something had shifted, and then everything unraveled. It started with a single envelope. Emma found it on her desk one evening, sealed and unmarked except for her name. Confused, she opened it, her brows furrowing as she scanned the first few lines. And then her heart stopped. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the words again, her stomach twisting in dread. She barely noticed Adrian walking into the room until he spoke. "What's wrong?" Emma lifted her gaze to his, her hands tightening around the letter. "Did you know?" His eyes darkened. "Know what?" Wordlessly, she handed him the paper. He took it, his expression unreadable as he scanned the contents. But when he reached the bottom, his entire body tensed. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice quieter than she had ever heard from him, he murmured, "Where did you get this?" Emma took a shaky breath. "It was left on my desk." Adrian's grip on the paper tightened. No one was supposed to know. Her heart pounded. So it's true. He didn't answer, and that was answer enough. Emma felt the floor beneath her shift, as if the world she had been trying so desperately to understand was suddenly slipping out of her grasp. A long-buried secret, a truth that could change everything. And for the first time since she had met Adrian Sterling, she wasn't sure if she was more afraid of what it meant for their marriage, or for her heart. The night was quiet, too quiet. Emma sat in Adrian's study, flipping through a stack of documents she had found in one of the locked drawers. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular, but now that she had found this, she wished she had never opened it. Her hands trembled as she skimmed the pages, her vision blurring with each line she read. A contract, not just any contract, a marriage agreement, an ironclad, meticulously written document outlining every single detail of their arrangement. When it would begin, how long it would last, and the exact terms of its inevitable dissolution. It was all there in black and white. Their marriage was meant to be temporary, a business deal, nothing more. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the paper tightly. She forced herself to keep reading, even when every word felt like a knife slicing through her. There were details about financial settlements, clauses ensuring Adrian would maintain control over her family's company, and even instructions on how their eventual separation would be presented to the media. She felt sick. Had everything been a lie? Every glance, every touch, every moment where she thought, just for a second, that Adrian might actually care about her. She thought back to the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his hand would ghost over hers, as if he wasn't sure if he should hold on or let go. The nights they spent working late, the rare conversations where his walls had slipped just enough for her to see the man beneath the ruthless exterior. Had none of it been real? Emma swallowed back the lump rising in her throat. She had been a fool to think that maybe, just maybe, Adrian Sterling, the man who had forced her into this marriage, had started to see her as more than a pawn. The proof was right in her hands. She had never been anything more than a transaction. Her breath came in shaky gasps as she stood, gripping the contract tightly as she stormed out of the study. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Emma found Adrian in his office, his back turned to her as he stood by the window, phone in hand. He was speaking in a low, controlled voice, but the second he saw her reflection in the glass, he stiffened. Something in her expression must have told him that something was wrong. He ended the call abruptly, turning to face her. "Emma." She slammed the contract onto his desk. "Tell me this isn't real. she said, her voice trembling. Adrian's gaze dropped to the papers, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression. Guilt. And that was all the confirmation she needed. Emma let out a hollow laugh, stepping back as she wrapped her arms around herself. Of course, it's real. Adrian exhaled, his jaw clenching. Emma, don't. Her voice cracked, but she refused to let herself break. Not in front of him. Don't you dare try to explain this away. Adrian hesitated, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He looked like he wanted to say something, but for once, the man who always had the right words was silent. That silence hurt more than anything. Emma shook her head, her chest aching. Was any of it real? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Did I mean anything to you? Adrian's lips parted, but whatever words were about to come never made it past his lips. And then, as if something inside him snapped, his expression hardened. His walls slammed back into place. And when he finally spoke, his voice was cold. Empty. You knew what this was from the beginning, Emma, he said, his tone cutting through her like ice. This was never about love. Emma felt the breath leave her lungs. She stared at him, waiting, praying for him to take it back, to tell her it was a lie, that he hadn't meant it. But he just stood there, silent, unmoving, destroying her. A bitter laugh bubbled up in her throat. Right, she whispered. Of course. Adrian's hands twitched at his sides, but he didn't reach for her. Didn't move. Emma swallowed past the lump in her throat, lifting her chin. I won't be your pawn anymore. Adrian's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. Emma, I'm leaving. The words tasted like acid on her tongue, but she forced them out. For a long moment, Adrian didn't say anything. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear him, he said, if that's what you want. Emma felt her heart shatter. That was it. After everything, after all the moments where she thought he might have felt something, he was just letting her go? Her chest ached, but she refused to let herself break down. Not here. Not in front of him. So she turned on her heel and walked away. And Adrian didn't stop her. Not even once. The mansion was eerily silent as Emma climbed the grand staircase for what she knew would be the last time. Every step echoed in the vast hall, a reminder of the emptiness that had always surrounded her here. This place had never been home, just a gilded prison with expensive chandeliers and cold marble floors. She should have felt relief as she packed her things, but all she felt was heartbreak. She moved mechanically, throwing clothes into a suitcase with shaking hands. She wasn't taking much, just what she had arrived with. Everything else belonged to this life, to him. She didn't want any reminders of the man who had broken her. Her engagement ring sat on the nightstand, its diamond glistening under the dim light. She picked it up, rolling it between her fingers, her chest tightening. It had once symbolized a contract, a deal she had been forced into. But somewhere along the way, she had let herself believe it meant something more. She clenched her fist and placed the ring on the table. It didn't belong on her finger anymore. A soft knock at the door made her stiffen. She turned slowly, half expecting Adrian to be there, to stop her. But it was Martha, the housekeeper. The older woman looked at her with sad, knowing eyes. You're leaving, Martha said quietly. It wasn't a question. Emma forced a small smile. Yeah. Martha hesitated before stepping into the room. Are you sure about this? Emma's throat tightened, but she nodded. I have to. Martha sighed, walking over and taking Emma's hands in hers. I worked for Adrian a long time. He's not an easy man to love, but I think you were the first person who ever made him try. Emma's heart twisted painfully. It doesn't matter, she whispered. He never loved me. Martha squeezed her hands gently. Maybe he doesn't know how. Emma looked away, blinking back tears. It didn't change anything. Love, real love, wasn't supposed to be this painful. She zipped up her suitcase and pulled it off the bed, straightening her spine. I'll be okay, she said, more to herself than to Martha. Martha nodded, though her eyes were sad. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. Emma swallowed hard. Thank you. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. And this time, she didn't look back. Adrian sat in his office, staring blankly at the whiskey glass in his hand. The liquor burned his throat, but it did nothing to silence the thoughts racing in his mind. She was gone. He had let her go. It was what he had wanted, wasn't it? He had told himself from the beginning that this marriage was nothing more than a contract, a necessity to secure his business empire. Emotions had no place in his world. So why did his chest feel so hollow? He could still see the way she had looked at him when she found the contract, like he had ripped her heart out. And he had. Adrian ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He should be working. He had meetings to attend, deals to finalize. But for the first time in his life, none of it mattered. The world could burn, and he wouldn't care. His phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen. Ethan. He let it ring. A moment later, a message popped up. "You're a damn idiot." Adrian scoffed, tossing his phone aside. He didn't need Ethan to tell him that. He already knew. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt meaningless. The house was too quiet without her. He had never realized how much life she had brought into this place. Now, the silence was suffocating. He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. He needed air. The city was alive as he walked through the streets, yet he felt nothing. He passed by high-end boutiques, restaurants where business deals were sealed over expensive wine, people dressed in designer suits and evening gowns. It was the world he had always known, the world he had built, and for the first time, he realized how empty it all was. His feet carried him to the one place he had never expected to go, Emma's apartment. He didn't even remember making the decision to come here. But now he was standing outside, staring at the door, his heart pounding in a way that made no sense. What was he doing here? He had no right. She had left. He had let her. And yet, he lifted his hand to knock. Before he could, the door swung open. Emma stood there, eyes widening in shock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" Adrian swallowed, his throat dry. He had spent his life negotiating billion-dollar deals, outmaneuvering ruthless competitors. But standing here, facing Emma, he felt completely lost. He trailed off, his usual confidence slipping. Emma crossed her arms. "You what? You decided you weren't done playing with me?" Her words hit him like a slap. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. "It's not like that." She let out a bitter laugh. "Then what is it, Adrian? Because as far as I remember, this," she gestured between them, "was never real." Adrian felt something twist inside him. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong. But wasn't that exactly what he had told her? That it was just business? He had spent his whole life believing that love was a weakness, that attachments only led to betrayal and pain. But watching Emma now, standing in front of him with her eyes full of anger and hurt, he realized the truth. He was weak because he had let the one thing that actually mattered slip through his fingers. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. Emma stiffened. "Which part? Marrying me or letting me go?" His jaw tightened. "All of it." She sucked in a breath, clearly thrown off by his words. But she recovered quickly. "Well, it's too late." Panic flared in his chest. "Emma, I'm not going to be your second choice, Adrian." She cut him off, her voice shaking. "You had your chance, and you ruined it." He felt his control slipping, his desperation clawing its way to the surface. "I was afraid," he admitted. The words tasted foreign on his tongue. He had never said them out loud before. Emma's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Afraid of what?" "Of you." His voice was rough. "Of what you made me feel. I told myself I didn't need anyone, that love was just another weakness to be exploited. But you changed everything." Emma's breath hitched, but she didn't speak. Adrian took a step closer. "I don't want to lose you." Her lower lip trembled, but she lifted her chin. "You already did." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, Emma exhaled shakily. "I need time," she whispered. Adrian's chest ached, but he nodded. He would wait. For the first time in his life, he would wait. Because Emma was worth it. But it didn't. She had shut him out, and he couldn't blame her. For the first time in his life, he had put his heart in someone else's hands. And she had walked away. A part of him had expected her to. Hadn't he pushed her to this? Hadn't he done everything possible to convince her he didn't care? Now, he was drowning in the consequences. He turned and walked away, his steps heavy, his mind clouded. As he stepped into the waiting car, his driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" Adrian hesitated. For the first time, he didn't know the answer. "Just drive," he muttered. The city blurred past as he leaned his head against the cool glass, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He had built an empire, crushed his enemies, and made himself untouchable. And yet, he had never felt so powerless. Days passed, then a week. Emma buried herself in work, keeping her mind busy so she wouldn't think about him. She had taken on new projects, pushed herself harder, tried to convince herself she was fine. But every time she passed a certain cafe, she remembered how Adrian had once taken her there after a long day, surprising her with her favorite pastry. Every time she heard the deep rumble of a car engine outside her apartment, her heart leapt, wondering if it was him. And every night, when she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the way he had looked at her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. She hated it. She hated that he still had this power over her. One evening, as she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed. "Ethan, you should talk to him." Emma frowned, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Emma, there's nothing to talk about." A moment later, another message came through. "Ethan, that's not true. You and I both know it." She exhaled sharply. Ethan had always been Adrian's closest friend, but in the short time she had known him, he had become something of a friend to her, too. But this wasn't a conversation she wanted to have. She set the phone down, ignoring the text. It didn't matter. Adrian had made his choice, and she had made hers. Adrian was unraveling. It wasn't obvious, not to the world at least. To his business associates, he was still the ruthless, untouchable CEO of Kingston Enterprises. But behind closed doors, he was a mess. Sleep was impossible. Work, once his refuge, felt hollow. His focus was shot, his patience thin. He had thought the pain would fade. It hadn't. And every day, without her, was worse than the last. One evening, he found himself standing outside Ethan's apartment, a bottle of whiskey in hand. Ethan opened the door, took one look at him, and sighed. "This is getting pathetic." Adrian scowled. "Just let me in." Ethan stepped aside. "You look like hell." Adrian walked in, dropping onto the couch. "Feel like it too." Ethan sat across from him, watching him closely. "Still haven't talked to her?" Adrian let out a humorless laugh. "She won't even look at me." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not surprised. You screwed up big time, man." Adrian ran a hand through his hair, frustration burning through him. "I know." Ethan leaned forward. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Adrian exhaled slowly. "What can I do?" Ethan studied him for a long moment. Then he smirked. "You're Adrian Kingston. You don't give up. You fight for what you want." Adrian's jaw clenched. "It's not that simple." Ethan leaned back. "Isn't it? You love her." The words hit Adrian like a punch. He had never said it out loud, not even to himself. Love. The word had always felt foreign, dangerous. But now, it felt like the only truth that mattered. His hands tightened into fists. He loved her, and he had let her go. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted, and he wasn't about to lose it without a fight. Emma sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen, but the words blurred together. She had been trying to move on, trying to forget, but her heart wasn't listening. A knock at the door startled her. Her pulse quickened. No, it couldn't be him. She stood, hesitating for a moment before walking over. She opened the door, and there he was, Adrian Kingston, standing on her doorstep, looking more disheveled than she had ever seen him. His suit was wrinkled, his hair slightly messy, but it was his eyes that made her breath hitch, because for once they weren't cold. They were raw, unshielded, filled with something that looked dangerously like love. He swallowed hard. "Emma." She gripped the door, her throat tight. "What are you doing here?" Adrian exhaled shakily. "I can't do this without you." Her heart clenched painfully. "Do what, Adrian? Lie to me? Pretend this is real?" He stepped closer. "It is real." She shook her head. "You expect me to believe that?" His jaw tightened. "I don't expect anything. I just—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "I don't know how to do this, Emma. I've spent my whole life keeping people out. And then you." He exhaled. You changed me. Her breath caught. I don't deserve you, he admitted. But I can't walk away. Not from you. Tears burned in her eyes. Please, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Give me a chance to fix this. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally Emma spoke. Prove it. And for the first time, Adrian knew he would do whatever it took. Adrian sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His empire, built with ruthless precision, now felt like nothing more than an empty monument to his own failures. He had spent years believing that power meant control, that love was nothing more than a weakness to be exploited. But now, sitting in the silence of his own regrets, he realized the terrible truth. None of it mattered without her. Emma was gone, and for the first time in his life, Adrian Kingston felt powerless. He had broken something precious, and he had no idea how to fix it. But he would fix it. There was no other option.